creation, in the forming of primal tribes right here in free America and in less developed countries as well, fighting one another generation to generation, in the global refugee status. So many people having to leave their homes because of conflict. We just observed Veterans Day and must be humbled by the numbers of survivors of wars who live on the streets. Now, I have a footnote there that's a little bit positive. I went looking for statistics on veterans living on the streets, and all of the entries on that first page of Google were about how many veterans were homeless but have been housed under new legislation just this past year, which pushes for housing and welcomes homeless veterans to be housed with a very good retention rate. In other words, they don't go back on the streets, they stay housed in great numbers, like 48,000 just this year. Someone said recently, in all this doom and gloom, at least we have Sweden. They know how to run a country and they know how to have peace. And yet, with all this revealing of reality, Mark's gospel calls the apocalypse birth pangs, with birth as a positive. Our passages today are about revelation, uncovering, and birth. They are not staying on doom as a theme, even though the early Christians faced plenty of that. They were persecuted and many executed for their beliefs. But their budding religious tradition was one of resurrection and hope. It was born of such a fragile beginning. Not only were pregnant Mary and husband Joseph refugees, but petty Mayor Herod, the reason for their fleeing, was ordering the widespread killing of Hebrew babies, first sons. The darkness, the trauma, and the fear must have been very real to them. And yet, they kept going, running from murderous danger, overcoming perils, eyes set forward. With each birth pang, Mary declared hope. Whether she had chosen these terrible circumstances or not, she chose hope. And I want to mention the donkey. With every step the donkey made, Mary and Joseph proclaimed life. I'm going to ask you to do a Baptist thing now, Jay.
Okay.
All right. I want you to say, in response to me, I'm going to say 3 words, and I want you to repeat them as loudly as you want, okay? There is hope.
There is hope.
Well done. Not quite Baptist level, but well done. I read an editorial in a magazine that collects religious news from around the world called The Christian Century this week. The title was The Grace of Apocalyptic Imagination. We heard that word in our first hymn, too, grace. The basic thesis of the editors was, and it seemed a stretch to me at first, but then I kind of came along, that out of the worst circumstances, good can be born. Apocalypse is not only an ending, but also a beginning, a birth. Elsewhere in that magazine, now you got to bear with them as these people write these things, an article is featured called The Music of Apocalypse. And it harkens back to the 80s and early 90s when some of you weren't born. In the time of heavy metal. Who's a fan of heavy metal here? Jay, you're the only one.
We got three.
Oh, and radicals, okay.
That surprises me.
Yeah, surprises are everywhere. Well, the author of this article on the music of apocalypse says that actually many of the lyrics, though you couldn't hear them, in the heavy metal songs were from the Bible, directly from the book of Revelation, from biblical apocalypse. Jack Holloway, the author, also writes that the reason the music was so loud and so, what's the word for not harmonious?
Cacophonous?
That's the word I was looking for. Thank you, cacophonous.
Of anybody who would know.
Yes. Cacophonous, loud and sounding of destruction, was that was what they meant to do. To, through music, share an image of the apocalypse with words of warning. Holloway writes, out of the negative, the good can arise, though, and they wanted to call people to hear that noise and respond. And of course, they were protesting social ills at that time. Holloway says, pessimism is part of the power of apocalyptic imagination. When things get cataclysmic and horrifying, we need daring, world-changing consciousness. World-changing consciousness. The world is provoked into good, into action, when everything seems its darkest. Listen to the jarring music. The setting may be destruction and destitution, but then comes the grace. Karen, our outreach committee chairperson, mentioned just a few minutes ago her work yesterday with Haitian refugees in Worcester. She does that work very often. I believe you said you handed out 275 sets of diapers this week? I'm sorry, 700 sets of diapers this past week. Large Catholic families, loving families, displaced from their homes, their country in rubble, racked by violence. Herein is the grace as horrors unfold. People like Karen and all of you do good. You refuse to drop the notion of grace. I wonder if you caught it in that Hebrews reading where in verse 25 it says that many Christians had stopped coming to church. Sound familiar? So much is calling upon people nowadays for that Sunday morning time. Very familiar to us. Many in our country, though they call themselves people of faith, this is still considered a Christian nation, no longer attend worship services or time of prayer together. That word together was also featured in our hymn and in that reading from Hebrews. The people of the church are being called to be together in their faith, their prayer, their worship, and their action. Many hands make short work. Work is made easier when many people come together. And I think in this day and age, we need each other for encouragement. People do band together in dark times, refusing to give in to what feels like an apocalypse. There are many mini apocalypses. When a family loses its home, has to flee its government, that's an apocalypse. That's the end of their world. But then they have the beginning of a new world, which may not look so good at first because of anxiety, fear, and trauma. But the grace comes when the Karens of our community, when we go and do good. When doom rears its ugly shadow, communities of people bear light. They bear hope. One example is an organization we support financially called the World Central Kitchen. 7 of whose volunteers, I believe it was, were killed recently, bombed in their vans, taking food to desperate people in Gaza. World Central Kitchen's thousands of volunteers go directly into the heart of need. They respond to shock and despair, to the basest of needs, hunger, with the food of hope, and with the reality that people care. We can also be inspired, as the children and I talked about, by the people of Western North Carolina, who recently experienced Hurricane Helene, many of whom lost their homes, and many of whom, though they had lost their homes, continued to be there and to help other people in worse need, according to their opinions. We learned just recently of donkeys being sent up into the hill towns to bring life-saving insulin and other supplies. Step by step, the healing that sustains life comes because people gather and assess need, then meet it. And it can be one bowl at a time, as with World Central Kitchen. Imagine what that means to someone who has lost everything and whose stomach is growling. Here, take this. It's free and I care. How many of you know who Václav Havel was? Okay. So we need to do some education, just real quick. Václav Havel was a Czechoslovakian politician. Actually, first he was an actor. How many actors become presidents? Yeah. Well, yeah, there's quite a few, actually. And comedians, in fact. Václav Havel was an agitator for democracy in a communist country that had become corrupt at the top levels. He was imprisoned for his voice, for his calls to his people to overthrow that government. His refusal to give up on hope eventually led to the overthrow of that government and to his election as president, a position he held in the new Czech Republic from 1989 to 2003. Not a flash in the pan. Never giving up, even in the harsh prisons, Havel said, "There is only one thing I will not concede, that it might be meaningless to strive in a good cause." Reversing the negative, it is meaningful to strive in a good cause. Havel was not afraid to stare into the abyss of his country's suffering and proclaim hope. Hope through words and action. The world he lived in needed a cataclysmic change. So he charismatically and eloquently led his people to that change through hope and action. The grace of apocalyptic imagination. World-changing. I hope that we gathered here in support of one another and in prayer and worship can be actors in bringing about a new world for people in need. May our focus be this: to do the good that is needed, meeting one face, one need at a time. And my favorite Buddhist illustration is of the power of the pebble dropped on a pool of water. That pebble makes one drop, but then what happens? Ripples go all the way across in all directions on that pool, making waves. Maybe it's true that hope, community, and a better life for the most vulnerable among us are still possible. Can I get an amen? Amen. Let's try again. 1, 2, 3. Amen. Hope. Amen. Yes, our hymn of reflection is number 422, God whose giving knows no ending.